Right, so I'll put a screwdriver behind that arm so it doesn't push back out of the way. Then I've only got to move the spring a little bit to unhook it. I don't have to stretch it for miles chasing a moving arm that it's coupled to. That should come out. Some of this stuff doesn't move very freely. Not sure what's going on. There's the little pallet wheel. Right, small springs. We have one small spring right here. We in the picture? Zoom you in a bit. Wrong way. That'll do. I'll put a toothpick over the centre so that spring can't get away and unhook it and lift the spring out carefully. That one's good at getting away. This post here is it's got a notch either side because it forms a post. It's not a simple screw. And I've got a variety of tools for getting rid of things like that. Can you actually see that? Oh, come on, camera. This piece here. There's a notch either side because there's a post up the middle. That's why it's not a simple screw. I've got a nicely mutilated screwdriver here which will couple to that nicely. That's tight, unusually tight. So there's a spring on there. Now that spring does two, that acts against the setting lever for our flash sync speeds. Now here's the B lever, we can lift that off. Could you see any of that? Oh, he keeps zooming this thing in. I'll put that back on so you can see where it was. Alright, so there's the B lever. Just get that off. Now that B lever actually swings in under a notch in that post. So you may find it awkward to get off it sometimes. Its return spring, I'm just trying to unhook that because it's trapped down here in the body. That's better. Its return spring is quite light and relatively easily damaged. See if I can get that off the post. Wriggle it off the post. There we go. That's what it looks like. Put that carefully to one side. There's nothing else there to fall off and bother us. That's good. At the back of the shutter, this plate's held on with 3 screws. They may be plain screws like this, comparatively thin heads on them. Running into counterboard holes, or they may be countersunk screws. Now that plate looks to me like it was made to take countersunk head screws, but they've used plain screws when they've assembled it. So it's a bit of an intermediary, I'd say. Okay, I didn't do that. I just zoomed out and the camera zoomed back in by itself. I'm sorry my video camera's playing up. But of course it also means I've got an excuse. When I look up at the camera and I see it zoomed into a ridiculous extent, I can say, well, that wasn't me, it was the camera. I think I'm going to have to reset everything on that camera. I don't understand how it's doing that. Okay, so that was the flash sync setting speeds lever. These hook into the case. They're a bit of a nuisance to get off. You've got to get them out round that flash sync. And here we have the case itself with the shutter blades. I'm just checking how smoothly this moves, moving the lever that would open the blades into the viewing position, and that's quite stiff. So that's why the shutter was very slow at oozing to a close prior to opening to make the exposure. It's basically just stiff. Now whether that's the shutter blades causing that problem or whether it's the blade actuating ring causing that problem, I don't know. Typically with these shutters it's more likely to be the blade actuating ring, because shutters like this are not as prone to oily blades as rangefinder cameras like the Retina 3C. And it's because the shutter blades are open to the atmosphere. They're not trapped inside between lenses like on a rangefinder camera. Okay, so here's the case. Now unless it looks quite oily, there's no value in removing that plate to clean underneath it because there's nothing happening under there. I'm just going to check that these 3 screws are tight that hold that plate in place. If they were loose, they can back out and foul the shutter blade, and I want to make sure that's not going to happen. That screw's a little bit loose, I've got part of a turn there, but they don't look like they'll be a problem. So that case has got to be carefully cleaned in the usual manner. Of course there's no diaphragm blades to worry about. And here we have our shutter blades. Now there are 6 blades because one of them is a cover blade. This one here is a cover blade. That goes over the same position as blade number 1. These blades look quite clean. Those blades are all the same. This blade here has got a steep notch in the back of the blade. That's because it sits in this position, and that notch is so it clears the shaft that comes through there. So we've got 4 blades that are identical. One blade that has a steep notch in the back of it, and one blade which is quite narrow, the cover blade. For the mechanism plate itself, I'm just checking this. Yeah, this is, you can hear that squeak. Can you see if you can hear it? No, you can't hear it. There was actually there's a squeak there. Now that'll be coming from this detent spring at this point, and basically it means it's completely dry between the detent spring and that post. And you've got a reasonable amount of spring tension there, and if it's completely unlubricated you get galling. The metal will be rubbing against each other and the action will be stiff. So that's all apart. That's all we need to do. I've got to clean all of this, get rid of any old grease and dirt and dust and rubbish of that sort. Same with our blade actuating ring. See, it looks quite dirty here. It's like thick dried grease by the looks of it. And the lens tube. Well, the lens tube of course holds the blade actuating ring in place. And I can see a line of corrosion around here on the brass. That probably means a drop of moisture's got in there at some stage, and that's enough. It'll make a rough patch on that brass. I can feel it with my fingernail, and that would provide friction against the blade actuating ring there in the centre, and that would make it stiff in its action. So yeah, that's unusual. You can see, if you look in here, you can see a little light spot right there. Now that's where the drop of moisture got in. It's dropped in from the front of the camera and it's settled on that spot. Now it might have been like a tiny raindrop, something like that, but it's settled, it's dropped in there and it's rolled around the edge and it's caused corrosion on that brass. Now because it's caused corrosion like that, I suspect it was a drop of sea spray, something like that. Possibly a tiny droplet of chlorinated water from a swimming pool. I wouldn't have expected a drop of fresh water to promote corrosion to that extent when we have a fair idea from the size of that spot that there was only ever a small droplet there. Okay, so that's my shutter in little tiny pieces. Let's get all these pieces here where you can see them. So all of these pieces now, I've got to sort these out, clean them and make a shutter out of them. I'm not expecting any problems, that all looks pretty straightforward to me. Right, well I'll break with my normal practice of lubricating the blade actuating ring with graphite powder. I'm just going to put some molybdenum paste around the inside edge of this. That's because of that corrosion that was on that brass lens tube there. I feel I might need a little bit more than I was using before, so we'll just make sure I've got that edge lubricated with molybdenum paste. Let's get this in position. Get this hooked in under the detent spring there. And hook the detent spring into position. Put the lens tube in, that'll only go in one way. Make sure the pallets aren't stuck under it, make sure nothing else is stuck under it either. And fit 2 screws in place. There are 3 screws that look much the same. One of them's longer than its mates, and that's the one that holds the bracket. So make sure you use the 2 shorter screws to hold the other positions. Otherwise, they'll stick out through the mechanism plate, and if they stick out through the mechanism plate, they'll catch the shutter blades and your shutter won't work. Likewise, if you've got the short one where the long one should be, it won't penetrate the mechanism plate far enough, and as a result, when you do your screw up nice and tight, you're likely to strip the screw out because it's only hanging on by a tiny amount. Okay, so that's in. I'm just checking the action of my blade actuating ring, and that feels nice and smooth. I've got to put some molybdenum paste where the detent spring runs over that. Might just as well do that now. I've got it in my hand. The other stuff we can do when this is back together, so I'm just putting some on here to make sure that that's coated, and that'll just make that action much smoother. This detent spring, if that's absolutely dry, you'll end up with shutters that do not work well at all. It should have some sort of lubricant on there. This molybdenum paste is just ideal. Graphite grease would do the job. Okay, so there's our mechanism plate back together, ready to go into the shutter. So I'll set this into the blades open position, and I'll put the blades back in place. We've got 6 blades, 4 of them are identical. We start right here. Blade number 2 has a big cutout in the back edge of the blade that goes here. Blade number 3, 4 and 5 are the same as blade number 1. Blade number 6 is the narrow blade, the cover blade. That goes directly over the top of blade number 1. Now I'm going to close these blades slightly, just a little bit. If you go more than that, the thing will ping shut under the action of that detent, and then you'll never get the case over the top. Right, now I'll get my case over the top. We get the round peg through the square hole. And if I put this back on my block of wood, it should be good. I'm holding that down firmly so that they're held together, and I'm checking, and I can see that the blade's open and shut nicely. So I can put the screws in the case. Because I'm keeping my finger on that case, I know that the case hasn't lifted up, and therefore that the blades will still be in the appropriate place. And we'll check again for good measure. That seems fine, and tighten the 3 screws up. Right, that's our shutter blades back in the case. Hold back that tab, which would be held back by your self-timer. Just checking the action. Yeah, it is nice and smooth still. And I've got this. This is the front of our Reflex S. Makes a marvellous stand to hold the shutter case while I'm working on it. It's not the front from our Reflex S because that's here. Right, start putting this back together. We've got the springs to put back in place, and springs are always entertaining. I'll zoom you in a bit so you can see the fun with springs. Right, so you're going to focus the after fashion. Got one spring here, and I'm just having a lot of fun trying to get it around the right way. Now hold a toothpick over the centre of that pin so that the spring can't get away. Lift the spring right out and hook it behind that pin. Well, that's the idea. That didn't work. Let's try again. That time. So now this lever's sprung loaded, this lever's sprung loaded. See the way the camera bounced back? I zoomed back out and this video camera just zoomed back in again. There's something odd about it. I've reset it, but obviously resetting it's not going to be enough. This is the spring for our B lever, and this fits over the post here. There's a groove around that post that the spring sits into. And I've got to get it seated in that groove, in this orientation, and then swing the tail of it back around there. No, it's moved, it's fallen off. Hang on, start again. Can't see it. Where's it gone? Has it fallen off? Oh, here it is. It bounced straight off. Let's see if we can get this thing on here. They are not usually so difficult. That's better. That's positioned there, and I've pulled it back. Now I've got to hook the B lever into there. So to do that, I'm going to Make sure I've got this in the blade's open position so that the B lever will drop in towards the centre, so that the spring won't be under so much tension. So I'm going to hook this into the B lever spring we've just put into place. No, didn't happen. There's a little notch in this B lever. I'm trying to get it to pick up that spring and carry it back. Of course, the B lever is nice shiny metal and the tweezers do not grip it. Let's try another pair of tweezers. These ones are a bit beefier, they might hold it for me. Let's hold that spring up slightly so I can get under it. That's better. I didn't want to just plonk it on top of that spring because the spring will get caught underneath it. I won't be able to fish it back out to fit it correctly. And here's the screw that holds that in place. That's that post that goes on the end of the special screwdriver. And I've found from experience that getting this on the screwdriver first is the answer. I've got that pegged to my screwdriver now and get this into place. No, it's just moved. Hang on. It's not square to the hole. Okay. I've got to get that B lever back in place because I've now lifted it off the post. Let's try with this screw again. We're in business. It's started. Check that the B lever, the thread's tight. That's unusual. Now I've got to swing this spring back over towards the centre. Swing it back the other way. So now that spring is against the lens tube in this direction and against this lever over here. And the B lever still moves nicely. So I'll hold the B lever back with my finger. I can draw the blades back into the closed position. Okay, that part looks good. Next, we want the pallet wheel. Drop that on there, make sure that moves smoothly. Appears good. We have this little sector gear on that shaft, on that arm that swings the pallet wheel around. I'm putting a little touch of molybdenum paste on that catch on the end of that arm so that it latches and unlatches easily, and swing that into place right here. That should fall down behind that arm. That's it. So now it's seated and you can see how it moves that pallet wheel there. I'll just hold this lever back and swing it round so that I can get the spring in place. Its return spring is this one. I'm getting that on my, held in my needle nose pliers. That hooks over a post here. There's a hook there. I'll just stretch it out and get the end of the spring into the arm. So that will lap, that's in the cocked position, and as the shutter starts to open, this will come back and release it, and the pallets run down. So that part's all good. Let's get this in place. This is the setting lever for the flash sync speeds and the self timer. There's a little detent spring on the inside of the case right underneath here that pin rides against, and these teeth here, I'll run a little bit of molybdenum paste over them as well. Now we're going to get this hooked into position. The trick here is to get this around that flash contact. Where are we? There. Where's the flash contact? Flash contact drops in here. And swing this around, and the pin has to go behind that spring. Because that's probably trapped behind that arm there now, is it? That's better. The spring on that screw that holds the B lever, and I'm just checking to make sure that it's not on the wrong side. It's on the wrong side of the lever at the moment. Let's get that tucked down. That's in place. So the spring acts against that pin. That part's in place. This cover plate goes on. It only goes on in one position, and if you press this tab in, that will allow it to drop down onto the plate below it. Otherwise it'll be, if that's not pulled out, it'll be sitting on top of it. You'll end up damaging it. 3 screws hold this in place. And this camera is a bit of, well, the shutter's a bit of a mix and match, because the recesses in this plate would be for countersunk screws, but they've actually got plain screws there instead. I don't know why. Well, it's not going to cause any problem. It's just a bit of a mismatch. Some cameras do have countersunk screws there, and others have plain screws, but the holes are counterbored to take those plain screws. This is a bit of a mix and match one. It's got a bit of both. Okay, so that part's done. Let's put this back in the shutter holder and get it back at a good working height. I can see what I'm doing. Right, what do I want to put in here next then? Flash contact stuff, I suppose. I'm just sorting out the best pair of tweezers to do this job with.